Hello, everybody in podcast land. I'm Dr. Ted Thatchencary, and this is MD Roundtable, a podcast about collaborating and learning from other healthcare professionals from all over the globe. We are all so much more connected due to technology. We have so much to learn from each other. Thanks for joining us today on MD Roundtable. Today's guest is Dr. Jacob Abraham, who is a board-certified cardiologist and specializes in heart failure management. He is currently the Senior VP of Medical Affairs for Edwards Life Sciences and is based in Portland, Oregon. He is passionate about the utility and benefits of implantable heart failure management devices. Welcome to MD Roundtable, Dr. Abraham.
Thank you, Ted. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Of course, yeah, no, it's my pleasure to have you on the show. Jacob, first of all, I always like to learn about your journey for our listeners. So if you don't mind, where did you grow up?
I grew up in a small town in the Ozarks of Arkansas called Mountain Home. My parents immigrated to the United States, and it's an interesting story to tell, but it's too long for our time today. But they ended up finding this small town in the Ozarks, which is where I was born and raised.
Oh wow, that's so interesting. Yeah, I've always actually wanted to go to the Ozarks because I hear they have excellent fishing.
Where I lived, where I grew up, was known for its fishing. So let me know. I'm happy to take you there.
Amazing, amazing. Jacob, who was your biggest influence on becoming a doctor, would you say?
My father was a physician and a surgeon, and I would say that he certainly had the most profound influence on my decision to go into medicine. He built a practice in this town of Mountain Home and really became part of that community over the 50 years that he practiced. And I remember growing up spending a lot of time in my dad's clinic. And to this day, remember actually the first heart failure patient that I ever saw was one that my dad introduced me to because he was showing me how to examine neck veins in a patient with heart failure. And little did I know at that time that those lessons that I learned then would have such a powerful resonance with what I'm doing now. But certainly being exposed to medicine at a young age and really coming to understand that my dad was a master at what he did, both as a clinician at the bedside, but also a surgeon. I just was inspired by his consummate professionalism as a physician, and that was inspiring. And he was, well loved by his patients and by the community, and so that was always something to aspire to. But that being said, he was also incredibly hardworking during that time of medicine, and he was in a solo practice. So I saw the toll that it took just in terms of his ability to spend time with us as a family. So even though I was inspired, there was also part of me that didn't want to enter into medicine as a career or as a calling because it did seem to have such a demanding lifestyle. And that was not helped when my two older siblings, who are 10 and 12 years older than me, respectively, also then, left the house and they ultimately went into medical school and residencies. And I remember just seeing them work so hard. And so there was hesitation on my part, at least when I was thinking about careers in high school and then into college, whether this was truly a calling for me.
Wow, yeah, that's fascinating. Is your dad retired or is he still practicing?
He's passed away now, but he worked,
Oh, okay. I'm sorry.
all the way into his mid 70s and was actually operating into his early 70s. And
Wow.
he was that physician that no longer exists because he trained. It's interesting. He trained at a time before DNA was discovered. And so in the 50 years that he practiced, you can imagine the explosion of knowledge. But he trained at a time when you
Right.
could be both a surgeon and an internal medicine physician, essentially. Obviously, you can't do that now with the explosion of knowledge, but
Right.
he was able to practice in sort of that golden era.
Wow.
And in that time, he conducted surgeries from the top of the head to the bottom of the toes and was really had an incredible career.
Wow. That's amazing. Thanks for sharing that.
Absolutely.
When did you realize that you wanted to be a cardiologist? This episode of MD Roundtable was sponsored by two anonymous donors in the memory of the late Mr. and Mrs. T.C. Sebastian Thatchencarry. Our donors have pledged to match dollar for dollar the first $500 that our listeners donate. So please check out the donate button and feel free to make a donation. Thank you, folks.
Well, maybe I'll take a step back and say, when did I decide I wanted to be a doctor? And that actually wasn't until my senior year of college. I majored in physics, and I sort of realized my senior year that I could not envision myself becoming a physics professor or doing basic research in physics. Even though I loved it as a intellectual passion, I just couldn't see myself, just based on my personality, spending my whole career devoted to that type of work, which is highly technical.
Mhm.
But at the time, it's also difficult to necessarily imagine yourself taking care of patients when you're a college student. But based on my inspiration from my parents and seeing the type of lives that my siblings were having and the extent to which they enjoyed their career, it seemed natural at that point, even though I had avoided making that decision and sort of resisted it my whole life. By the time I was a senior in college, I realized like that was really the pathway I wanted to take, because you could take the best of what I liked about physics, and this will play a role later in why I became a cardiologist. But you can really apply the sciences to benefit humanity, and that was really what spoke to me. And then in terms of becoming a cardiologist, that was just a natural extension, honestly, of sort of my love of the basic physical principles and being able to understand the circulation in terms of hemodynamics and pressures and flows. And that was just a natural extension of my love of physics. But I will say that before I was interested in becoming a cardiologist, I actually thought I wanted to become a surgeon, like my father and like my older siblings. And so I actually vividly remember the moment in my third year of medical school, it was my last rotation, when I encountered a patient who completely changed the trajectory of my career. Because up to that point, I had done rotations in surgery. I'd actually done a sub-I in surgery. I'd done research in surgery. And I was, inspired by all these people to really become a surgeon. And then as a third year medical student, it was my first night on call on the internal medicine service when a young woman was admitted through the emergency room with shortness of breath, bilateral infiltrates, and hemoptysis. And she was diagnosed in the emergency room, and the intern that I was on call with agreed that she likely had community acquired pneumonia. She was a 32-year-old, in inner city Baltimore. And so community acquired pneumonia seemed like a very reasonable diagnosis. And yet, despite treatment over the course of the night, she was becoming more and more tachycardic, more short of breath, and ultimately more hypoxemic. And I remember when I examined her, I was able to appreciate that she had a diastolic murmur, but I hadn't put that all together with the other findings until the next morning when I presented her at the bedside, as they do at Johns Hopkins, to the team and to my assistant chief resident, who happened to be a cardiology fellow.
Oh.
And I remember to this day, he asked me, what did I think was going on with the diastolic murmur? And what did I make of the fact that the patient had elevated neck veins, which I had missed, but he was noticed from across the room when I was making my presentation. And he actually listened to the patient right there in front of everyone. And I remember he turned to the patient and said, "We're going to make you feel better soon." And then he wheeled in an echo machine about an hour later and confirmed that she had rheumatic mitral stenosis. And she then underwent mitral valve surgery that same admission. And this case just made such an impression on me, first because he was able to just use bedside examination skills to make the diagnosis of heart failure. It also immediately convinced me that cardiology was the most interesting field and heart failure was the most interesting disease state. And little did I know at that time that, one, I would be so inspired by that chief resident that I would one day follow him into practice in the town of Portland, Oregon, years later. And that, secondly, I would one day join a company whose mission is to treat patients with structural heart disease. So a lot of foreshadowing in that one moment that you can only appreciate looking backwards.
Right. Yeah. That's a great story there. So, and did you end up doing all your training in the Baltimore region?
I did. I completed medical school, residency, fellowship in cardiology, and I was actually myself a chief resident all at Johns Hopkins. And if you have any Hopkins listeners out there, the next question will be, what firm were you on? So as a medical
Mhm.
student, I was on the Barker firm. I was on the Thayer firm as an intern and resident. And as chief resident, I was on the Janeway firm.
I see.
That's a little bit of insider knowledge for the Hopkins people out
Yeah, yeah.
there.
Nice, nice, nice. And how long did you practice clinical medicine?
So I practiced for a total of 16 years. I moved to Portland in 2009, and I stopped my job in practice in June of 2025. Celebrated my 90th day at Edwards this week.
Fantastic, fantastic. So 16 years in clinical medicine. So kind of switching gears, I give you a lot of credit, right? Because as physicians, we tend to get kind of stuck in our careers, right, in clinical medicine. But I think it takes a lot of courage to make that crossover like you did to the industry side and leave direct patient care, right? Leave clinical medicine. So what was that like for you? Like, if you could just kind of go back to, your thought process, like what were some of the major factors that you were, just thinking about making that transition?
I thought about a lot of things. I realized that, as you said, this process of reaching this decision was one that occurred over time. It was certainly not something that I decided to do and made this leap. I would say it was probably a multi-year decision, but there were sort of three considerations that led me to this conclusion. The first was that my experience building a heart failure program at Providence, which is the health system I worked in, brought me to the realization that much of the advancements in care were built through collaboration between industry and clinicians. And in heart failure in particular, much of the innovation was based on device therapies or device interventions, which at least at that time were outpacing advances in drug therapy. So that was the first realization, is that, hey, industry is driving much of the progress in this space. And then secondly was my own interest in heart failure. As you say, I think a lot of us become master sort of the day-to-day practice of medicine, and it's hard to leave that because it's what you know, and it really does take courage. But for me, what I was finding that kept my attention and my interest in medicine was increasingly the clinical trials and the investigation that I was participating in. And while I always will love patient care and I always pride myself on my clinical abilities, I realized that if I was going to make a bigger impact and really grow in my own career, maybe the best way to have that happen would be through making this type of transition. And then I will say, finally, I'd had the opportunity to interview for similar roles with other industry partners. And ultimately,
Mhm.
I found that Edwards was particularly interesting to me for a lot of reasons, but most importantly because of its culture and its emphasis on long-term strategic thinking, its deep investment in R&D, and fundamentally its mission and its values and its patient focus, which really resonated with me as a clinician. And so I felt that even though I was going into industry, it was at least in a company whose values and mission really spoke to me. And I think that now that I'm on the side of it, that has largely borne out to be true. I've been very happy in this transition and feel that I'm making an impact already, even though it's only been 90 days.
Yeah, that's very intriguing. How has it impacted your overall lifestyle, just leaving clinical medicine and in this new role? What would you say?
Well, I think the most obvious impact is in terms of travel. I would say that travel will wax and wane at any given time, but I probably spend about half the time traveling. Fortunately for me, much of that is domestic, much of it is to California or to Chicago, so it's not terribly far away, but that does disrupt one's personal life, one's family life. And so that's been a major change. I think also, how you spend the bulk of your day. It's a lot of meetings, it's a lot of Zoom for me, since I'm not physically located at either one of Edwards' main headquarters. And so I spend a lot of time, on Zoom or on Teams calls and going through PowerPoints. And because of that, there's a lot of just back to back meetings, and that can be exhausting in a way that's different from, say, the practice of medicine. But at the same
Mhm.
time, I would say the colleagues that I work with are all very brilliant. They're all incredibly capable. And any concerns that I may have had about types of interactions I would be having or my role in the company have been immediately alleviated because it's been a real pleasure to work with the teams that I have now had the privilege to work with.
Great, great. And what about just, like your time, right? Because do you feel like you have more time to spend with your family, time for hobbies, stuff like that?
I thought that I would have more time actually than I do.
Yeah.
I think that's partly a artifact that I live on the West Coast, and I have colleagues in Europe and colleagues on the East Coast and across the country. So my days actually can begin earlier.
Hmm.
And because there's so many meetings, I can work until 7 o'clock in the evening. And then there's no post call day. So I oftentimes find myself between the travel, which is frequent, and needing to get a lot of important work done that I'm actually probably spend more time actually working or traveling for work, total hours spent, than probably I did as a clinician, which had you told me that before I started, I wouldn't have believed it. But I actually probably spend more time involved with work than I did as a clinician.
I see. That's very interesting. And what about, you don't have to give me details, but like what about like salary? Obviously that must have been a big factor that you had to consider, right? Being a heart failure cardiologist specialist, right? I'm sure, you were making a decent income. Was that a concern?
Absolutely. I mean, we all have families and have to educate our children. So that was definitely a question I had. Interestingly, without going into details, a lot of corporate compensation occurs through stock and bonuses. And so
Hmm.
there's a lot more that is left not in cash or a salary, as you might expect as a physician. But over the long term, that may prove to be of greater value. So while my total cash compensation is actually lower, the long term success may come through stock grants and bonuses. But a lot of your salary really comes through those other instruments rather than through cash.
Got it. Okay. Great. Well, switching gears again, you're an implantable heart failure management device specialist. Do you want to tell the audience what exactly the pulmonary artery pressure sensors do and the utility of this device?
Absolutely, be happy to. As you said, the main focus right now is a hemodynamic sensor that is implanted through a catheter based procedure into the pulmonary artery, which enables patients to make a measurement of their pulmonary artery pressure on a daily basis. And in addition, with our system, patients can also measure a daily blood pressure, heart rate, pulse ox, weight, and a symptom report that is sent through a virtual cloud connection to a secure website where clinicians can review all this data and manage the patients. We know from lots of physiologic and randomized clinical trials that pulmonary artery pressure correlates strongly with outcomes in patients with heart failure, and it predicts both heart failure hospitalization and correlates with survival. And we further know that reductions in pulmonary artery pressure that are achieved through medication adjustment can improve heart failure events in patients who have chronic ambulatory heart failure. And so, what the system is really intending to do is to better manage chronic heart failure. As many of the listeners will know, heart failure is a progressive disease. And despite optimal medical management, whether for HFrEF, reduced ejection fraction heart failure, or preserved ejection heart fraction, preserved EF heart failure, patients are at risk of both hospitalization and disease progression, ultimately with death. And by managing the hemodynamics of the patient over time, we hope to improve patient outcomes, quality of life, and symptom burden.
That's very intriguing. And have studies shown that this technology reduces heart failure hospitalizations?
Yes, there have been a number of randomized trials, meta analyses, and post approval studies that have shown the benefits of pulmonary artery pressure monitoring. For our system in particular, there was a single arm study that showed that our system, which includes, as I mentioned, the other vital signs, and I think importantly, allows patients to also see their own pressure data, which is a unique feature of our system. In that context, we were able to demonstrate the lowest rate of heart failure hospitalization and all cause mortality in any published study to date. And on that note, we are coming up on a international heart failure conference called the Heart Failure Society of America. And at that conference next week, we'll be reporting 2-year outcomes from that trial.
Great, great. Where is that conference going to be held?
That'll be in Minneapolis.
Minneapolis. Okay, fantastic. And for our listeners, Jacob, can you just explain like what is the burden of heart failure in this country as far as numbers go?
Thanks for asking that because that's such an important question. As I'm sure your listeners who are clinicians can appreciate, heart failure is incredibly prevalent. It's estimated that there are now around 7 million Americans with heart failure. But by 2050, with the aging of the population, the growing burden of comorbidities, this number will increase to 11 million.
Wow.
And when we look at the lifetime risk of heart failure, it's 1 in 4 people will develop heart failure in their lifetime. And so the numbers of patients who will have heart failure, not only in the US, but globally, is expected to reach, epidemic proportions. And I think it's worth highlighting as well that we often learn in medical school and afterwards that heart failure is predominantly a disease of the elderly, which is true, but it's also increasingly affecting younger people. And sadly, the prognosis of heart failure in younger people has actually gotten worse over time than it has in the elderly. And so we're actually seeing a backslide in survival outcomes for younger people in particular.
I see. I see. Yeah, thank you for sharing that data. And the PA sensors, can they also be used for both like precapillary pulmonary hypertension patients and postcapillary pulmonary hypertension patients?
So their current approval is for post-capillary pulmonary hypertension, but a number of patients, as you can imagine, have multiple comorbidities and will have combined pre and post capillary pulmonary hypertension. It has not yet been approved, though there's obviously intense interest in treating patients who have precapillary pulmonary hypertension, and there are ongoing studies looking at its utility there.
I see. I see. Okay, very interesting. And what are the challenges that you face in this field right now?
I think the biggest challenge relates to the data itself. We provide clinicians with a lot of data, but how do you manage that data, particularly when a lot of clinics and health systems have limited resources already? And now we're providing you with more information. And this information at present doesn't automatically surface and integrate into an electronic medical record. So that's problem number one. And then the related problem is how do you develop workflows that allow you to take all this information and convert it into actionable data? And I think one of the benefits of our system that we have at Edwards is that we provide access to all the vital signs, which allows clinicians to make decisions based on a more comprehensive data set than PA pressure sensors alone or PA pressure alone. And I think the other important thing is that we are hoping to empower patients to manage their own pressures and their own vital signs, much in the same way that glucometers revolutionized diabetes by giving patients insight into their disease state and allowing them to manage it. So, one of the things that I'm excited about in our current trial is that we are studying clinician directed patient self management, which again begins with the patient having visibility to their own data. And we've seen very high rates of patient engagement and what you might call behavioral remodeling in some of our earlier studies, where patients get the biofeedback that certain behaviors or, say, diet may impact what happens to PA pressure. And that can be a very powerful source of information for patients to, again, understand how their behavior impacts the disease and what they can do to better control their disease.
I see.
And I think all of this is important in terms of that fundamental problem that I talked about is the data, how it's managed, and who's managing it, because we do have a crisis in the heart failure space and that the number of fellows who are going into heart failure as a specialty has been on the decline for the past few years. So there's this fundamental irony that never before has it been a better time to be a heart failure doctor, because you have more tools, more technology, more drugs available to you. And yet, unfortunately, there are fewer and fewer specialists who know how to capitalize on that technology and those advances in order to benefit patients. So we as a industry, I think, both have to inspire fellows to go into heart failure as a field, but also to make the technologies that we have work better for the clinicians who are managing the patients. And that, again, starts with how do we support the clinics in terms of making this data more digestible, and how do we develop the evidence in terms of how do you lower pressure? I mean, the evidence has always been to date, or what's been done in the trials has predominantly been a diuretic focused strategy, which makes sense. These patients have heart failure, their PA pressures are elevated because their left heart pressures tend to be high. But a lot of patients who, despite diuretics, will continue to have elevations of PA pressure, and it's that population that is likely at highest risk of future events. And so we're very interested in focusing in on that population. And one of the elements of our current trial is that patients who have persistently elevated pressures are going to undergo more rigorous evaluation by a group of PH specialists and heart failure specialists to better understand if anything further can be done to reduce those elevated PA pressures. So I think there's a lot of basic hemodynamic and physiologic understanding that needs to take place for us to best capitalize on the information we're surfacing.
Yeah, fascinating, Jacob. Thank you. And how do you stay up to date in this specialty?
Well, for starters, I listen to this podcast. I mean, I read the journals, and certainly before taking this job 90 plus days ago, I was involved in clinical trials. I was fortunate to be able to participate in as a PI in a lot of trials. I was able to give talks and write papers and attended all the conferences. So I'll still be reading the journals. I'll still be involved in the research. I just won't be on the byline anymore. And I'm also, of course, very fortunate to be engaged with the academic community and really smart clinician colleagues from whom I will continue to learn. And as I mentioned already, I have tremendous colleagues at Edwards who keep me on my toes. So I have lots of intellectual stimulation to keep me up to date.
Wonderful. Jacob, what are some of your interests outside the hospital? I'm sorry, outside of work. How do you like to decompress?
Well, first, as a cardiologist, I certainly appreciate how important prevention is. And I lost my own father to cardiovascular disease, so I
Mm.
personally try to be very diligent about exercise, though that's been increasingly hard with my current travel schedule. When I do have time, I make it an important part of my routine to get in exercise. And then, of course, I like to spend time with my family, and I would say my love language is cooking as well as eating. So when I'm not cooking, I do love to enjoy the very high caliber food scene here in Portland, and try to enjoy the natural abundance, both of cooked foods as well as the wine scene here in the Portland, Oregon area.
Ah, great. Okay, what type of dishes do you like to cook?
Well, I like to make a lot of Asian dishes, including Indian food, given my ethnic background. But I like anything that's spicy, anything that has those Asian flavors. So Thai, Chinese. I like Japanese. I've actually gone down a deep rabbit hole and learned how to make some pretty good ramen. So anything that I love to eat, I try to replicate at home so I can have it more often.
That's terrific. What is the one thing that you would like to highlight about Oregon for potential visitors?
Well,
I've never been to Oregon.
yeah. I'm so fortunate to call Oregon home. I will say that I've been here now, as I said, since 2009, and there's so much about the Pacific Northwest in general to enjoy. Obviously, we have incredible natural beauty, but given what I just said, I would probably just highlight that there is a very vibrant food scene, from food trucks all the way to higher end restaurants. Incredible wine scene with the Willamette Valley, with wineries that I think rival Napa and Sonoma. And if you're into coffee, as we are here in Portland, then there's a really dynamic coffee scene. And I think just overall, from a culinary perspective, Portland rivals cities that are both much larger and much more expensive. I've always been impressed as I travel that food that is incredible in other cities, we can actually get something very comparable in Portland for less. So I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to live here and enjoy all of that.
Amazing. Yeah, your
So,
coastline.
despite what you hear on the news, Portland has a great quality of life and
Yeah,
remains a
yeah.
wonderful city.
Great, great. Yeah, your coastline is just gorgeous. It's beautiful.
Absolutely.
But great. Well, before we wrap up, Jacob, how can listeners get a hold of you with if they have any questions?
Your listeners can find me on LinkedIn, as well as following the Edwards Implantable Heart Failure Management on LinkedIn as well.
Okay, and I will be sure to add that in the show notes if you don't mind.
Would love that. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Abraham, for your time and being a guest on MD Roundtable. Keep doing the great work you do with Edwards Life Sciences, and hopefully we can meet up one of these days at a conference.
That would be great. Thank you so much for having me on your show.
You're welcome. Have a great day. Folks, if you enjoyed that episode, don't forget to leave a review of MD Roundtable Podcast, and don't forget to subscribe. Also, if you want to reach out to me with any comments or questions, feel free to go ahead and email me at drtedthatchandcarey@gmail.com. Once again, Dr. Ted thatchandcarey@gmail.com. I will also leave the email contact in my show notes. Thank you again for joining me. Have a great day.